Cuts for distillation. Literally one of the most important things to learn in this hobby is how to make good cuts. And this video is going to give it to you. So it's going to give you the whole A to Z of kind of the overview and the process of what you do. But more importantly, it's going to give you specific little tips and tricks along the way to really help you make kick-ass cuts. How's it going, chasers? I hope you're having a kick-ass week. Cuts. Like I said in the intro, these are literally one of the most important things that you can learn to really start producing a quality product with distillation. And this method is going to have you dividing your entire run up into multiple different jars so you can go back and check it later on. That's a relatively basic idea. So the real meat and potatoes of this video is the little tips that pop up along the way that are going to, step your game up at each point of the process. And all those little tiny gains are going to add up to making something a whole lot better. So for new distillers, I mean, there's just really not a lot out there that's more important in terms of getting a leg up in the hobby, in the craft, in creating spirits quickly than nailing cuts. And for the experienced distillers, creating cuts in your way for your method with your goals in mind is really one of the ways that you get to sort of have some creative expression in the hobby and really create what it is that you want to create. Now, I know this method of dividing it up into multiple jars is just not practical on a large scale. So it's not going to be for people running a commercial distillery. I totally get that. In saying that, what you can do on a commercial level is use this method for your test batches. Use this method on your pilot still, perhaps, to really get something dialed in, to really understand a spirit, and then be able to, go to making cuts on the fly with your larger equipment. The same goes for the home distiller that just wants to dial in a recipe, or you just want to nail that perfect single malt, that perfect style of single malt, and you keep making it over and over and over again. You can use this method that I'm going to teach you the first few times to really understand the spirit, get it dialed in, and then switch to making cuts on the fly as the spirit's coming off the still. So all in all, basically what I'm telling you is that watching this video, understanding this method and these tips and tricks is going to help you just make much, much, much more effective and reliable cuts. Speaking of effective and reliable, it's time to talk about today's sponsor, Manscaped. They sent over their performance package for me to check out. These guys know kick-ass packaging design, but let's get on to what is inside that package, shall we? You may have noticed that they have a ball deodorant and ball toner, because let's face it, your junk gets kind of funky sometimes. They also have a nose and ear trimmer because if your hair grows kind of like a Yeti, then these things are awesome. But let's get to the star of the show, the new Weed Whacker 3.0. This thing's actually a pretty decent little beard trimmer, but that's not what it's for. It's for trimming down. The skin-safe design and ceramic blades ensure drastically less cuts down south. And to be honest, guys, I'm not worried at all about being pretty cavalier with this thing on soft skin. Actually, let me just show you on my Kiwis. The thing feels great in your hands, but even better, it's waterproof. So once again, if you're a Yeti, you can literally hose it off. So use the promo code STILLIT at manscaped.com today to get 20% off, plus free international shipping and 2 free gifts. Your balls will thank me later. Wait, what? Anyway, now my Kiwis are smooth. Should we get back to making cuts? I think what we need to do first is give you an overview of this entire process really, really, really quickly. So when I start giving the tips and tricks, they're going to make more sense. So let's jump on over to the still for a second, shall we? So the basic principle of this is super, super simple. We're not doing anything different with the still. We're not running the still differently. We're not doing anything weird or wonderful there. Literally all we're doing when we're running the still is collecting into individual jars. And literally, as one fills up, we move it over, we put the next one in, and this one's going to start filling up. I'm not actually running the still today because I wanted to really focus on making this video kick-ass rather than making product. I think you get the idea though, right guys? As a jar fills up, we number it, we move it off, we put another one underneath, we collect these jars up and keep them in order, and you're going to end up with something that looks like this. So this is our entire run spread out in front of us, divided into little jars. Why? Well, simply because it means that now I can go along and taste this versus this, and then this versus this, and that versus this, and different things from different parts of the run against each other, which I'd never be able to do if I was collecting on the fly off the still. So perhaps when I was collecting on the still, I thought that, yes, this is the end of heads, and this is where hearts are starting. I'm going to make the cut, and now this goes into the pot. You can't take that out. Once it's in the pot, it's in there. But now, when I'm over here on the bench, that I taste this next to this, I can decide, actually, I don't know if I want this in there. So I think the overall process makes a whole lot of sense to you. I think you understand how you kind of physically do this on a really basic level. Let's get stuck into the tips and tricks that are going to make it a whole lot more easy and a whole lot more effective for you. The first one might seem really freaking obvious, but I have personally screwed up with this at least once. As the jars are coming off the still, either be insanely religious about the order that you put them down, so you know exactly what jar comes before and after what other jar, or to be honest, what you should probably do is label them. As they come off the still, that's just going to help you out a whole lot later. It's going to give you peace of mind. You're not going to have to worry about it. Like I said, I have mixed this up before, where I've put things in rows and columns to make better use of the space. And then I've forgotten, there's a random jar left out afterwards, and I don't know where it came from. It's not the end of the world because you can just assess it in and of itself, but makes things a whole lot easier if you keep it well organized. The next thing to keep in mind is the jars themselves. And what I mean by that is you're going to want to collect up a pretty large collection of jars, and there are certain things you want to look for, believe it or not, that are going to make your life easier. So the first thing is you're going to want to find your standard kind of jar size, and you're going to want to make up most of your jar collection with a very similar kind of jar. So for me, I use jam jars, peanut butter jars, whatever, as long as they can fit 500 mils. And you can actually see that I've put little marks on the jars to sort of indicate different volumes at different parts of the jars. I haven't engraved all of them, but most of the jars in my standard collection are engraved. And the reason for that is especially for the hearts part of your run, once you're pretty sure you're in the hearts, it is really, really advantageous later on in the process to be able to fill the jars to the same volume over and over and over again. So knowing that jar 5 is 500 mils, 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10 are all 500 mils makes things a whole lot easier later on if we want to mess around with tinctures or doing like little test blends. But you'll see that up here at the beginning of the run, I've got some randomly sized jars. And the reason for that is that as I'm switching or transitioning between sort of areas on the run, I like to have better resolution. So for example, let's say that this is going to be the turning point of heads to hearts. And somewhere in this jar is where I really want to make the cut. If I could make the cut drip perfect. Well, if that happens halfway through this jar, and this jar is only 100 mils, then I've lost 50 mils of product that I could have kept as hearts, for example. Having, a few, sort of 5 or 10 of these randomly sized, different sized jars is going to serve you quite well. Once you get better at this process, the inverse will be helpful as well. It'll be nice to have something that's, 2 or 3 liters perhaps. And once you know that you're solidly in the hearts and you've done this process a few times and you know that the next 2 or 3 liters of product is all going to go into your cut, having a jar that's 3 or 4 liters that you can just whack under the still and let run for a while, that's pretty handy too. Now the exact size of jars that's going to best suit you is going to basically depend on the size of your still, but also the size of the wash that you're putting into the still. So what I mean by that is if you're doing 150 litre washes, 3 stripping runs, and popping them through the still into 1 spirit run, that's a lot of spirit you're making. So if you're collecting jars that are 150 mils, you better have a whole lot of them. On the flip side, if you're running a little, 5-litre pot still, then collecting into 500 mils jars is going to be pretty close to half your run, so it kind of defeats the purpose. Of course, obviously, you don't have to fill jars full. The next step is to make sure you're not tuning out while you're running the still. I know, I get it. You're saving everything. You're going to assess it later on. You're going to make cuts later on, so on and so forth. But here's the thing, guys. It's still important to be tasting what's coming off this spout throughout the run. But I'll give you the 2 ways that I do it. Number 1 is to use a Glencairn glass, simply because there really is something magical about the shape of these glasses that lets you nose products really, really well. So I'll just literally take that, pop it under the spout, and then top it up with a little water if needed, depending on the proof of what's coming out and the type of product that's coming out. Let it sit for a couple of minutes, give it a wee swirl, have a smell, have a taste, to really get an idea of what's happening on the still at that point in time. The second one, and I probably shouldn't be telling you this, but I'll be honest, I do it a lot, is just literally stick my finger under the spout and taste it. And then to go a step further, I'll quite often put my finger under the spout, give it a rub on my hands, just, kind of make it very volatile, and then have a smell. But why do you want to do that? Well, first of all, it's going to help you find transition points during the run. So like I said earlier, when I was standing over at the desk, I like to move down to smaller jars to basically give me greater resolution when I'm getting to the tricky decision points of the run. Number 2, it is a really nice way to just get a feel for the spirit that's coming off the still before you start making active decisions. You're going to start building this kind of mind map of what happened. Oh, it's fruity and floral up front, but there's some weird, nasty, jaggy potpourri heads. But as it gets down to the bottom, we're starting to fight between, when does the wet dog turn up, but there's some nice full-bodied, creamy mouthfeel down the bottom. You get the idea, right? All I'm saying is, if you're tasting it throughout the run, you're going into your cuts with a bit of a map as to what to expect already built into your brain. And lastly, it's just a really good way to train yourself to make cuts on the fly. So as it's coming off the still, you can practice if you want to. You can take some notes and say, right, if I was making cuts on the fly as the product was coming off the still, I would have cut it at jar 12. And when you get to the bench and when you assess it later on, check your own work, see how you're doing. The next tip is about just chilling and taking your time if you need to. I used to recommend covering your jars up and letting them kind of air out for about 24 hours, sort of 12 to 24 hours, to let the more volatile stuff kind of just evaporate and make it easier to taste and assess your product. I'm not so sure that that's really worthwhile anymore. But what I do think is worthwhile is just taking some time out. If you've been running the still for 4, 6, 12 hours or something crazy, and you've been tasting as you go, I mean, let's face it, it's kind of an intense process. You're probably a little bit burnt out, and you're probably not in the best mindset, the best physical state to actually assess your product. I think most of the benefit in waiting is coming from getting yourself back to a better mind state. Put all your jars aside, cover them up, go and have something to eat, have a tea, do whatever it is that's going to get you into the right mindset and to sort of cleanse your palate, and get you to the right point where you can taste the cuts. Once you're at that point, have at it. Here's a few little tips though, guys. If you are going to leave it sitting, make sure you cover it up properly, because even if you think you don't have bugs around, you're probably going to find some if you leave your jars out uncovered for a few hours. Honestly, the easiest way for me is just to line them all up, throw some paper towels over the top, and leave them like that. If you're going to have to leave them for more than 24 hours, you're going to want to find a way to seal them up, to cover them up, because let's face it, guys, they're just going to keep evaporating and they're not going to sit around and wait for you forever. The next tip has to do with the proof that you sample or taste everything at. And honestly, the best advice I can give you here is don't be a hero. Don't go tasting stuff at a crazy high ABV just because you think that's what you should do for some daft, weird, macho reason, or because it's the proof that's sitting in front of you. Proof it down to a ABV or a proof that you are comfortable tasting at. If you're, drinking barrel proof stuff all the time, then that's cool. Tasting at 55%, that's just going to be normal for you. And in some ways, that's probably what you should taste at to get an idea of what's going on in those samples. But if you drink 40% whiskey with ice in it or water in it or something, you're probably going to want to knock the ABV down to that sort of level of ABV or proof that you're used to tasting at. Another tip is that you may even want to proof it down a little bit lower than that, just to really sort of open those samples up, open the stuff that you're tasting up, and see if there's anything else hiding in there that you wouldn't taste at a higher ABV. This is especially useful for hunting for tails. If you've got something that you're not sure if it's tailsy or not, proof it down a little bit further. Get it down to 35%, 30% perhaps, and you're going to be able to tell a whole lot easier if there are tails lurking in that specific jar. Now, the exact mechanics of how you do this, I get it. If you've got 30 odd jars sitting in front of you, it can be kind of a pain in the ass to figure out how to proof them all down. There's two things that I would suggest you consider using. Number one is one of these guys, a syringe. Shock horror, I know. It's plastic and rubber. Yeah, I use it all the time, to be perfectly honest with you guys. My thinking is I'm not storing anything in it. It's going to be in there for all of 4 seconds, if that. Super, super easy to be able to draw a sample of a very specific volume out and deposit it somewhere else and mix it with, a certain amount of water. Pro tip here, which I probably should have mentioned earlier on, guys, if you're really onto it, when you're taking your cuts off the still, you can write on the jar what the percentage ABV it is at that point in time. You've probably got time to do that while you're running the still. And then when you get around to tasting it and proofing it down, you've already got the numbers in front of you, so you can figure out how much water you need to add to how much alcohol to get the proof you want. Cool. If you don't like this idea, for whatever reason, or you just don't have one handy, there is one other thing that you can do. Sorry, it's in my pocket, where I often keep my spoons. Teaspoons. This doesn't work so well. So don't let your significant other see you doing this, but so simple, so very practical. Yes, don't worry guys, we are actually going to get into tasting these cuts and tips on that soon, but one last thing that I want to mention before that, and that is the vessel or the glass that you're going to be sampling out of. Now, if you've watched this channel at all for any length of time, you will know that I use these things a whole lot. Glencairn glasses. Yes, they do actually make a difference. No, you don't specifically have to use these Glencairns. You can pick up a Chase the Craft Glencairn glass on the Chase the Craft store, except right now you can't because they're, I think, out of stock. We're working on getting those back as soon as possible. I'm actually sipping on some Buffalo Trace while recording this video. Quite nice. What I'm saying is, guys, is the vessel or the glass that you drink out of really does matter. And at the very, very least, make sure that you're consistent with the glass that you're tasting out of for the run that you're tasting out of. So what I'm saying is don't have one Glencairn sitting here and taste a couple of samples out of that, and then, pour some into a glass like this and taste it out of this, because you will change the results based on the glass that you're drinking out of. If you don't want Glencairns, I totally get that. They are expensive, they just are. But aiming for this kind of tulip-shaped glass really does help, with a bowl at the bottom, a narrower top at the top. And about this sort of distance between the two is ideal. You can get wine glasses and stuff that are, they're pretty close. Yes, I know I'm using these as a prop, as cuts jars. I do actually use my Glencairns as cut jars from time to time, just because the volume's great. I know it's kind of ridiculous to be using these glasses for cuts, but I do actually do it. Anyway, shall we move on? So, we're at the point now where you've got all of your jars, all of your cuts lined up in front of you. You're all ready to go, and you're all ready to start tasting. Now, a lot of people's first, I guess, inclination or first instinct is to start at one end and move all the way through to the other end. And I can get why you would think that, but that's actually not a good idea. What you should do is aim right for the middle straight away, right for the middle of what you think is totally safe hearts. So you take a sample, you'd proof it down to a proof that you're ready to taste at. And I think I forgot to mention in the last point, you want to be tasting everything at a pretty similar proof. So you don't want to be comparing stuff that's 80% to stuff that's, 45%, for example. You want to be trying everything at the same proof. All right, so at that stage, aim for the middle. The reason for this is that is going to be the safest spot in terms of protecting your palate for as long as possible. If you dive straight in up here and you get it a little bit wrong and you take a large whack of heads, you might blow your palate out completely. Same if you go way down here to the tails and you just get like a giant dose of nasty ass wet dog, that might blow your palate out for a little while. You might not be able to taste anything else. So start in the middle and work your way up and down and out, if that makes sense. Getting closer and closer to where you think you're going to exclude product from your cut. Once you start to sort of dial in that you think that somewhere in this area is where the transition from heads to hearts is, and we'll talk a little bit on what you're looking for in a minute, then you can start going down here and looking for the general area where you think the tails is. And then go back and find the specific locations for both. Once again, you're just trying to kind of preserve your palate for a little bit longer, give yourself the longest amount of time actively tasting in a meaningful manner. And that leads on to our next tip, which is give yourself time. If you get to the point where you're just a little bit overwhelmed by all of this, and trust me, it happens to me all the time, especially if you've got a large amount of jars on the table, you'll get to a point where you're kind of guessing and you don't really know what you're tasting. Take a break, man. Go inside, sit down, drink a beer or have a cup of coffee or tea or whatever it is that you do. Have dinner, watch half an hour of TV, whatever it happens to be. Just hit the reset button and then come back to it. And that'll remove a whole lot of mistakes from the process for you. It'll stop you doing things on autopilot. It'll stop you kind of guessing. And I'm sure we know when we do this, right? You're kind of going through the motions and guessing and not really doing things properly. You want to remove that from your process. So what is the actual goal of tasting all of this? The actual goal is to decide what you're going to keep and what you're not going to keep. And the simplest version of this is that you have heads, you change, hearts, tails, and you change. The heads and the tails go into feints and you keep the hearts, put them all together and use them for this, this run. Doesn't necessarily mean you have to do it that way though. You might cut straight from heads to hearts here and then say, right, this is tails. At this point, I don't like this jar and this jar, but by the time I get to this jar, there's actually something kind of interesting going on. Maybe there is some of the bad stuff, but maybe there's some good stuff that I want as well, and I'll keep a little bit of this jar. In saying that, you also don't need to keep whole jars. If you're really sitting on the fence about, oh man, there's some delicious fruit flavor here in my fruit brandy that I've made, but it is a little bit prickly and spiky, you can decide to keep half a jar. You don't have to keep the whole jar. And we'll talk a little bit more about that and a way you can test that in a minute. So what are you actually thinking about to decide whether you like something or don't like something and whether or not to keep it or not keep it? The biggest one for me is smell, and I'm including the whole retronasal thing in that. So a lot of what most people think about as flavor is not actually flavor, it's smell. If you don't know what I'm talking about, look up the whole retronasal thing. Google it, check it out, that'll help you out a whole lot. So smell, retronasal smell, or kind of like the smells you taste, actual taste, and then the presence in your mouth. And what I mean by that is it prickly, is it sharp, is it burny, or is it creamy, or is it velvety, is it smooth, is it jaggy, and then all of the kind of things that bridge sensation and flavor. So bitterness, astringency, those kind of things that are kind of not quite here nor there. The general things to look out for and the general things to try and avoid in the heads side of things is a prickly, piercing, tingly sensation around your mouth. A smell or aroma that's really like kind of cleaning products, can be acetone-y, turpentine-y. I quite often find a lot of weird sort of fake, fruity, potpourri kind of estery things going on up here. Problem is, the problem is if you're working with fruit, quite often a lot of the really fresh, delicate flavor of the fruit that you're working with is going to live around here. So if you're working with fruit products, quite often there is a give and take when you're making a spirit as to how much heads you're going to let into how much fruit flavor you're willing to lose. And that's really your call. Down on the other end, when we get down to the tails, the sort of stereotypical things that often get thrown around are wet dog, wet cardboard, toe jam, all of these weird kind of funky, musky, nasty sort of things going on. And this is the opposite. So with brandies and fruit stuff, a lot of the flavor decisions you have to make here in terms of compromises. With a lot of the whiskeys, you're going to be making compromises down here. The grain, earthy, more dark, sort of grungy flavors that come from whiskey are generally sitting around in this area. And if you're using smoke, especially if you've got smoke in there, you're going to go delving down into the tails a little bit to find that. And you're going to be doing the same thing. You're going to be trading off between the flavors you want and the flavors you don't want and deciding exactly how much of a compromise one way or the other you're going to make. Another tip that really has to be mentioned, I think, at this point in time is the longer you plan on aging something, the more you can get away with grabbing, how do I put this without putting you completely wrong? The more you can get away with grabbing at flavors that you want to keep and assume that a lot of the flavors you don't want are going to change over time. And a lot of the master distillers, especially from Scotland, will say that that's the magic. Taking that weird stuff that's sitting down around here gives them more smoke, for example, if it's a peated single malt. But also some of the funky weird stuff that lives down here is the magic that turns into the X factor over time in a barrel. Now, this is hard, man. This is really hard because how long are you going to age it for? Let's say you're going to age it for 2 years. What if you get that wrong? You're not going to know you get it wrong for 2 years, right? So my idea on this is to err on the side of being a little bit clean. If there's a flavor in there that you just really don't like, I would cut it out for now while you're getting used to this. One final tip in terms of the flavors that you're looking for here to keep or not keep. I would suggest finding a commercial example of the kind of spirit that you're trying to make. So if you are making, like I said, a fruit brandy, go and buy a nice fruit brandy, the same kind of fruit that you're working with, and really look in that brandy to see where it sits in terms of how much heads they've let through. Do you enjoy that much heads in your products? Do you not enjoy that much heads in your product? You get the idea, right? The same with whiskey. Go and have a taste and then have a think about the weird flavors that you can actually find in Scotch that do sort of come from this area. And you may find that you actually almost enjoy some of these things in very low amounts without knowing it. That's just one more tip, I think, in terms of getting a little bit of a calibration on this without having to just do it hundreds of times. The next tip is to do all of this with a notebook next to you, or a laptop and an Excel spreadsheet, or whatever it is that you feel comfortable working in. As you're tasting the product, think about what you're tasting, what you like, what you don't like. Think about the flavors that might work well with something or not work well with something. Think about all of the flavors that you've tasted and what they're adding up to. Keep notes. Talk about what's in each jar, jar 27, awesome smoke, but way too wet dog, or, use your own shorthand. And the reason I say to do this is similar to the idea of what I was saying in terms of creating a mind map of the spirit as it's coming off the still. Now we're really starting to flesh out our understanding of what's in these jars, and putting it down onto paper kind of forces you to really think about it. So in some ways it's more about making you think than actually having the notes afterwards. But the flip side of that is if you get to a point when you're blending and you're not quite sure what to do, looking back at those notes and being able to see an overview of everything that you've tasted at a glance rather than having to remember what's where can be super, super valuable. The next little section of this process, or the next tip that I want to give you, is probably one of my personal favorites in terms of just the sheer enjoyability of going through this process. So we've got all our cuts laid out in front of us. We know roughly that we're going to cut here for heads, for example, and here for tails, for example. And we've got our notebook or our computer or whatever it happens to be with all our notes written down. Now is not the time, in my opinion, to start throwing things together. Now is the time to step back and think and conceptualize what this can become, what you want it to become, what you're aiming for, what your goals are, whether the raw ingredients in front of you are going to really give you what you want, in your opinion, and to make a plan for how you're going to blend this stuff together. So, for example, let's talk peat, because it's my favorite topic. But I'm trying to make, let's say, a peated single malt here. The number one goal I'm probably going to have is to get the amount of peat I want in it, right? So straight away, that changes my mindset. Rather than just, oh, headsy stuff bad, tailsy stuff bad, I keep hearts. Instead of thinking in that really simplistic manner, now I'm thinking about how do I build up a smoke profile, and what else do I want to layer in with it to build out a product that's got multiple dimensions to it, for example. So I start thinking, how much smoke is sitting in this area here? There's a bit, but then it's going to be balanced out with this that's got absolutely no smoke in it. So perhaps I want to start delving a little bit deeper into these kinds of things. Now, I know that sounds really airy-fairy, and I know that might sound really strange or scary to people if they haven't done this sort of thing before. But in my mind, it's literally the same as going to your pantry and thinking, what should I cook tonight? I'm not going to use a cookbook. Fuck that. I'm just going to look through and start putting things together, and I'll use this sauce with that spice. It's kind of the same sort of idea, right? I think about flavors that are very, very similar, that work together towards a common goal. So once again, to go back to the more food or baking world, milk and vanilla. I mean, how many times have you seen that combination? All the freaking time, right? Or if that's not your jam, let's try another one. I'm trying to do this off the top of my head and I'm stalling because I can't think of coffee. Dark coffee and dark chocolate. Similar flavors that work towards the same goal. I'm not talking about your milk chocolates. I'm talking about that dark ass chocolate, like 80% and up, plus black coffee. Similar flavors, absolutely banging together. But you can also pick things that are completely at polar opposites from each other, right? You can pick things that are very, very different, things that are going to kind of fight each other, and in that tension that they cause between each other, they're going to create magic. The classic sweet and sour sauce is another one that, kind of jumps to mind with this sort of thing. The point being is, think about where you're getting flavors that'll add to each other, and think about where you're getting flavors that'll contradict each other, and how you can use that to improve the spirit overall. The other thing to think about is kind of the weight, the feel, the texture of the spirit. And if you're, for example, going for something that is supposed to be the complete opposite, the complete opposite of a Islay Scotch, you want it to be light and feel almost effervescent on the tongue, you might want to avoid the stuff down here simply because it's heavier and grungier in terms of the feeling on your tongue. Maybe it's not in your specific example. I'm just saying, if it is, you might want to consider excluding some of this stuff. It's not adding perhaps any flavor specifically that you like. All it's doing is adding volume to the blend and kind of grunging it up a little bit in terms of that weight. Or it could go the opposite way. You want something really thick. You want something really luxurious on your tongue. And you have, a couple of jars here that are really just tasting kind of like neutral spirit compared to everything else. And all they're going to do is kind of make the blend feel more volatile on your tongue. Perhaps that's not what you want. I've got 2 more tips that I really think you should listen to, but before I give you those, I need to say huge thank you to the Patreons. Thank you so much, Patreons, for letting me do this kind of stuff. I really, really do appreciate it, guys. So thank you. The next tip is basically not to just get carried away and YOLO this whole thing. If you get to this point, you've put a whole lot of work into this, right? You've made the wash, you've fermented it, you've distilled it, blah, 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 blah. You put so much work into this, don't jump the gun just yet. So my tip to you would be to consider doing one of two things. The first one, and the easiest one, is to get to the point where anything that you're not sure about, you remove. So let's say we're not sure, we're cutting somewhere here, but we don't know. This is definitely in, but these two, we're going to make our mind up about later. Remove those from the situation for just now. And the same down here. We definitely know that this is out. That's just nasty. We don't want it. Move it over. These two, we can't decide on. Perhaps we want some of that smoke. Perhaps we don't. We haven't decided yet. Let's move these over. But this one is pretty clean. There's no wet dog, and there is some very interesting peat in it, for example. All right, so now we've got these 5 jars here, and we're almost certain, we're almost completely certain that we're keeping these, right? Whack these into a container, blend them all together, and have a taste. See where you're sitting, and use that to decide whether or not to add, these two or this one or whatever it happens to be. The reason I say to do that is that quite often it's hard to get a feeling of what the aggregate flavor is going to be. So if we're sure that all of this is just, we're 100% sure we're keeping it, why not put it together, blend it together, and have a taste and see what it's like. At that point, you can either just make a gut call about, this has actually got heaps of peach flavor from my peach brandy, and it's not worth messing with the borderline really headsy stuff to get a little bit more peach flavor out of it. I'm going to leave it out. Or the flip side of it, this single malt is not tasting very smoky, and it is also tasting very, very clean. So sure, I'm going to fuck with this and half of this, for example. It gets you one step closer without having to do every step in one go. Cool? All right, the other way to do it is to make a tincture. So basically, we're going to make a test batch. And the reason that I said way back when that you want to try and keep as many of these jars, especially in the middle, at known volumes as possible is because of this right now. So our trusty syringe or teaspoon again, you can literally grab yourself another vessel or even just straight into a cup and go along and take a known volume out of each of these and just do the math on how much of each other one you're going to add in. So let's say that each of these are 500 mils and that these are whatever. I mean, I know they're not, but 100 mils and 100 mils. You go and take 5, 5, 5, 5, 5, 1, 1, 1 mil out of each of them, blend them all in together into a cup, let them sit, stir them up a little bit, proof them down, taste it. Is it too wet dog? Is it too nasty from the tails? Is it too headsy from up here? Yes or no? Does it have enough smoke? Does it have enough fruit? You can basically do a test blend of your cuts without committing to anything. This last tip is probably honestly the most important out of all of these because it allows you to improve on an ever increasing and self-repeating cycle. And that is literally just to make sure that you record everything that you do and then go back and compare that against the results. And the reason for that is simply because this hobby, this craft, the cycle between doing something and figuring out whether you did good or whether you fucked up is so freaking long that you need to make sure you're doing it. So assess your spirits because your skill as a person assessing the spirit is going to improve the more you do it. Your skill as a distiller is going to improve the more you do it. And your ability to articulate what it is that you just personally like and don't like is going to improve as well. So taste the spirit, assess it, figure out what you like about it, what you don't like about it, and then look back at your notes of how you made that. look back at what you were doing in the past. How can you adjust? How can you improve? How can you apply what you've just learnt to the next batch you make? Really, that's all there is to it. And it sounds simple and obvious, yet you would be amazed how many people never do this actively. They just kind of passively go through the motions and assume they remember what they did to make this spirit. So there you have it, guys. I believe I've earned my whiskey tonight. This was kind of a lot of information to put together into one video, but I really hope it helped you out, guys. I really, really, really do. If any of you have suggestions on other tips and tricks that you want to add to this, please, by all means, stick them down in the comments. And one final tip for the new distiller is things like this are a lot of freaking information. They really are. And how do you put it? It can seem really simple on the surface until you start doing it. And then when you start doing it, you realize all of the little nuances that go into these kind of things. So this might be the sort of thing where you want to watch the video a couple of times before you do your first set of cuts. Do it a few times and then come back and watch the video again, or go back and find some other sources to read through or listen to. And, you know, don't give up on the learning cycle after your first go or so, because there really is layers of this that there's no way you can understand how important different things are until you've got your hands dirty, basically is what I'm saying. Anyway, keep on chasing the craft, guys. I'll catch you next time. See ya.